so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. Let me pass straight on, and we'll take questions of clarification after the members of the panel have spoken before moving on to our discussants. But let me move on to Dr. Merylyn Hedger for a presentation of a case study work in Bangladesh.
Right, thank you very much. As Imi explained, this project, which was financed by the EU, was undertaken by DIE, IDS, and ODI. Just a little plug: there's some copies of some of the briefings outside, and you can get the full working papers of the case studies from the ARD website. I should also say that what you're going to hear on Bangladesh from me is sort of an external institutional focus. Khurshid Alam will be talking soon from a political economy focus on Bangladesh. We chose Bangladesh as a suitable case study to look at from an adaptation finance perspective. Obviously, everyone here knows about its extreme vulnerability to climate hazards, irrespective of climate change. 60% of the country is less than 5 meters above sea level, and it has severe cyclone every 3 years. It has apparently 40% of the total storm surges in the world. There's endless statistics like this, so it's a very vulnerable country. Aid is vital for its national development programs and has been ongoing for some time, though in fact it's not as crucial as we might think. It's only under 10% of the whole government budget, but it's funds about 50% of the development program. The development assistance there is susceptible to climate change. If you may remember, the OECD study done by Shardul in 2003 showed that 50% of development assistance was going to be vulnerable to climate change. It was a very early start on the NAPA, 1995, the first one, and about 3 years ago it produced the Bangladesh Climate Change Strategic Action Programme, which is a very comprehensive approach to trying to frame adaptation with priorities identified. It has a long-established scientific community. Interestingly, this was all generated in the first place by the US Country Studies Program way back in the early 90s. That's where a lot of these gurus that we all know about, who are actually at the minute in Bangladesh on the community-based adaptation workshop, and we know those from in the climate change world. That's where they started. And then also Bangladesh is now a climate change finance priority under the World Bank PPCR. DFID's just made it one of the few country programs it's going to work with, and for the EU as well. So just briefly, the way we worked, there was a review of existing information, usual stuff. Then we had some structured discussions in Dakar, and Nur Al-Azam helped me very much with the field work there. Spoke in detail with various people in the Environment Ministry and also the Finance Ministry, different departments. They've just set up an aid effectiveness unit there. Most of the key donors, the EU member states and the US and Japan, Switzerland, and then there's further analysis, published material. So what I'm going to outline here is what's working in Bangladesh on climate change finance at national level, identifying some of the challenges, and then to look at the lessons for effective delivery. So what is working? Well, there are new financial mechanisms established in Bangladesh, impressively. The government set up its own Bangladesh Climate Change Trust Fund. I'm afraid the acronyms get very confusing here. And they've all got about the same amount in them, which is not exactly by chance, I have to say. But we'll come back to why there are two program trust funds in a minute. Then the donors have got a Bangladesh Climate Change Resilience Fund. That's the BCCRF. And then you may remember, I think some of the NGO representatives here will well remember the issues around DFID putting money into the World Bank's pilot program Climate Resilience. But in fact, lo and behold, Bangladesh has now got one of the special programs on climate resilience under that. And then, I started my involvement in Bangladesh because I helped to frame the first phase of the Comprehensive Disaster Management Program in 2002. And at that time, DFID and UNDP were saying, no, we don't want to set up climate change separately. we want to mainstream climate change in disaster management. And that programme's still rolling on and now in its second phase. And this is actually one of the problems that one has, that you get policy change in donor governments and governments, and you end up with ongoing financial instruments. Anyway, but all these financial mechanisms are established. This is to the credit of a lot of hard work by all the people who've got them going. And they've got them all aligned. They had to come a lot of tricky, contentious issues about the role of the World Bank, and the multi-donor fund is now operational with the full support of the government of Bangladesh, and ways around the fiduciary risks have been chosen. The donors and governments have all stepped up to the funding challenges in Bangladesh, it has to be said. And if you ask these people who are running them, all these funds are complementary, and they have put a lot of effort into trying to assure that they're aligned. Well, that's I think then they have tried. And then actually under the aid effectiveness process in Bangladesh now, which is a way that climate change is being realigned, interestingly, because if you look at the UNFCCC process, aid effectiveness is sort of ruled out of court as a model. But within Bangladesh now, the joint coordination strategy is underway under the Paris Declaration process, and there are local consultative groups, one of which is on climate change. So those are all positives. But of course, if you look at the challenges around that, you've got 3 funding mechanisms which came operational last year, as well as the CDMP second phase, Comprehensive Disaster Management Programme second phase, which has a climate change component in it still. So what's going to happen? Are these going to consolidate as pressures on funding increase, which, as Imi said, are already visible in the EU, or will they further differentiate their roles? And then the other major challenge is absolutely no doubt meeting the scale of the funding challenge. And nobody really knows how much it's going to cost, and it depends what you're costing, of course, anyway, because of the intricate relationships with development, which we'll come back to. And the World Bank did Bangladesh as one of their case studies for all their new climate change costing analysis, but they didn't really make much progress. All these figures can be sourced, and if you look at the case study, you can see where they come from. But we've got the first NAPA came out with 4 billion for the priority projects, none of which really funded. The strategic programme, the first 5 years, that's for 5 billion. For coastal polders, another 4 billion, and on an annual basis, 5,600 million. And then if you look, interestingly, a study was done of the annual development plan process, where the government itself is spending 4.7 billion a year on development, and of that, 2.7 billion has been identified as being at risk of climate change. So just to, that's the right scale. Okay. The other major areas of challenges are capacity, because basically a lot of the problems we're talking about are really due to lack of capacity to handle them, in my view. Improved coordination, lack of innovation about developing climate change projects is impeded by this lack of know-how in all organisations. This goes for donors as much as anyone else, in my view. There's a tendency to go down the business as usual road because you haven't got capacity or energy to develop new projects. The NGOs have got limited capacity, and the private sector, of course, this is the big new area for a lot more attention. And they've run, the IFC there have run seminars on climate change in the private sector, and they have, when they're dealing with other risks like major blackouts of power for 8 hours and regular strikes, climate change, doesn't figure very large and is regarded as a government risk. Then if you look at climate change finance in the context of development generally, there's a backlog of aid, and all ministries need more capacity for project generation and management. And in fact, if you look at the problems around the core Ministry of Environment, which has never been a spending ministry ever, and it's not really a full cabinet ministry yet, it's really difficult to increase capacity there because of all the recruitment rules around the civil service. And if you put consultants in, they then opt out and go into different ways of working on climate change. It's really difficult to build up a pool of capacity within the ministry because there have been efforts. So where does all this leave us? Well, obviously, we've got there's a need for improved planning, coordination, and prioritisation. Prioritisation, particularly, as to what happens first. There's the Bangladesh Climate Change Strategic Action Programme has developed a very large number of projects, and really, although they're formally called prioritised, there's far too many to really be a meaningful programme for work within a planning process. There is a local coordination group on environment and climate change within the aid effectiveness process now, which is now headed up by the UK, and that is a formal mechanism whereby some of these issues can be resolved if there was good trust, and that is now getting underway. One of the things that should happen more is that these different funding mechanisms, there should be ways put in place now to ensure there's learning from them all, and which is the best method, and what is happening, sharing good practice, and just see where things work and when things don't work. In fact, I was quite shocked what a lack of data there was on all the past projects and current programs that are there. This is a criticism of donors, not the government. It's quite shocking how little information's around. And then it's vital to embed climate change into the planning process, and that has started. UNTP has put in a cell into the core planning ministry, which is trying to look at environment, poverty and climate change together in the annual programmes. For effective delivery, monitoring, reporting, verification, this is going to really I think, motivate, be another drive for transparency on aid. But it's going to be a massive challenge, and there's no real idea about baselines at the minute. And then what is the climate change component and development? Because if you look at how donors within the country are looking at changing and stepping into climate change, they're doing it in a variety of ways. Some of them are just evolving their ongoing development programme. Some of them are seriously doing a step change. Others are responding to their national government's approaches and becoming more bilateral and less multilateral. Others are working in a different direction. And then others have really tried to respond to the Bangladesh country action plan. So it's very difficult actually to untangle what's happening and to get a way forward on measuring input. There's not been enough learning really from previous projects and programs. The NAPA was reviewed under the LDCF evaluation that IIED did, and it found it had left a very limited legacy, just a technical planning legacy. It hadn't really left an implementation legacy. The first CDMP has been evaluated again, and that was disrupted massively with political change, strikes, problems with engagement. But those evaluation reports are not being taken forward within the climate change new programs. They're being done by consultants, and they're there, but no one's really using them. Now, one way forward is often sectoral funding, which is working on education. This is a way you can overcome some of the fiduciary risks. But climate change is in fact a cross-sectoral funding challenge, and there's no real models actually in development for that in terms of forward progress. If you look at the Fast Start funding in relation to Bangladesh, it's quite interesting. The EU, to its credit, published all its Fast Start funding allocations prior to Cancun, and according to that, they'd already made allocations to Bangladesh. But no, that wasn't, as far as I could gather, in consultation with the government of Bangladesh. They'd relabelled money they'd put down already and said this was Fast Start funding. And if you look at the story on Fast Start funding across the EU, it is inconsistent. Although to the EU's credit, it did bring it all together so it could package it as a whole for Cancun. And the EU Commission have tried very, very hard, I know, to get coherence across the member states. That is not where the fault lies. Transparency by relevant partners is vital to generate better trust. And then I sort of combine prioritisation programmes with the government, donors and NGOs could avoid problems later. So just to look forward now, there's a real need for innovation and new thinking. As I mentioned, there's a real tendency to spend money now along business as usual pathways. There will be, as Amy's talked about already, massive changes which will affect 2020 climate change finance in Bangladesh. It's actually on the trajectory to become an MIC, and that's part of election campaigning now, which could have quite substantial implications because it benefits within the within the UNFCCC because it's an LDC. And then how will the UNFCCC really face the issue whether it's poor people or poor countries? You know, because basically there's as our former colleague Andy Summers has shown, there's so many more vulnerable people. Basically, if you look at climate change perspective, there's millions more climate change people in coastal areas in China. And you know, when push comes to shove, will India and China really try and get this UNFCCC money? They haven't definitely said no yet. So that might squeeze Bangladesh. Then we've got the known unknowns, the natural disasters in the rest of the world. Japan, actually, if you look at the Fast Start funding commitments, or promises, not commitments, it was supposed to deliver half of them. And now you've got DFID helping with water supplies in Japan. So, you know, and basically there's no doubt national delivery is going to ultimately depend on what national governments do.
Okay. Thank you very much, Merylyn. Let me just open it to the floor for questions of clarification at this stage. Does anybody want to ask Merylyn a question of clarification? Yes.
Just Donald Curtis from Birmingham, ex-Birmingham anyway. Just on the you talk you're mentioning things about the institutional structures of Bangladesh, and UNDP putting a cell in a ministry and that sort of thing. Aren't there fundamental underlying problems about the institutionalization of governance in Bangladesh, which underlie all this?
I think I'm going to pass that to Khurshid, because I think this is exactly what he'll be talking about. Is that all right?
Let's hold that question and we'll come back to it later. There was another question here. Clarification, please, only at this stage.
Caroline Pope from KPMG. I was just wondering, when you talked about MRV systems, exactly how you felt the MRV should be, whether that should be at a national or an international level.
Well, it will have to be at national level, because otherwise you'll never get a handle on it. But that's the challenge, because as I said, it was quite shocking how very difficult it is to get information about, you know, current and ongoing programs in a consistent way by donors currently.
Okay, so can you just state your name and where you're from as well for our online audience?
This is Sam Bickerseth from CDKN. Merylyn, thank you. Could you elaborate a little bit more what you meant by there was a planning legacy from the NAPA but not an implementation legacy? That was a really interesting phrase.
Well, that's the phrase that comes out of the LDCF evaluation that was done by Cowie and IIED for Dunedin with Jeff. So I can show you, I can refer you to the report. Simon Anderson did the report. But basically, and I'm sure Khurshid's done a real analysis about the NAPA process in political economy terms. So I think again he can come back. But that was the judgment. Although Bangladesh got off the ground very, very fast with the NAPA, and all its thinking was very important to the whole NAPA process, the real legacy when push came to shove was the planning process. And in fact, in terms of implementation on the ground, that donors hadn't stepped in at the right times and done things fast enough. So that then they did another NAPA, and then they changed to this Bangladesh Climate Change Strategic Action Programme. So, you know, there's planning documents, but it's just getting things going.
Okay. Okay. One last question of clarification, please.
I'm James Eustace from the Regional Climate Change Programme for Southern Africa. I'm really interested in the Climate Change Trust Fund, which you mentioned, because of its link to national government, and maybe, I don't know, afterwards or maybe not now. I'd really like to hear more about how it was set up, how it's functioning, and is it really a country-owned process? And I'm just really interested in how that works.
Yes, well, it is very, very interesting, and I'm sure I expect Kirsty will be coming back to that as well. But the idea was to have one fund initially, and then it was impossible to get agreement between the government of Bangladesh, who wanted control of disbursement, and the UK and Denmark, the UK particularly as prime donors, because of the fiduciary risk issues. So that's why they ended up with two. I mean, it was never intended to have. And Bangladesh government, because it got exasperated, moved fastest and moved ahead, but then actually had real problems allocating the money. And then everyone rushed around just before Cancun, and the government, Bangladesh, allocated money in some ways has been very heavily criticised for some of those allocations in Bangladesh, I should say. We can go into that. And then the donor fund now is finally underway, because they did get the government of Bangladesh they did get an agreement about the role of the World Bank, which is going to act as a secretariat for a 3-year basis under the control of the government, the Management Council, which is the government's very strongly represented on. And then during that time, the World Bank's building up capacity within the government to take it over. That's the theory. So it is a big issue, and a lot of the NGOs here were involved in the initial stages. There was a big London conference in 2008. There's a lot of history.
Merylyn, we've just got one question coming from our online audience.
Okay.
The question comes from Marcus Manuel. Can Merylyn expand on the MIC point? As his understanding is that the UNFCCC criteria is LDC, and as graduation out of the LDC takes years, it is possible to be a MIC and an LDC for some time.
It sounds like I wouldn't necessarily dispute that. I mean, it's the LDC is a different classification from the LIC one. But I'm also thinking, I was thinking more broadly there about the way that the issue of poor people is going to play out in the UNFCCC. I mean, I think there's a lot that's going to change. I mean, in a way, Bangladesh isn't ultimately that dependent on aid either, actually. And its economy, despite all its problems, has been growing, has been surprising everyone, has been extremely resilient, and had managed substantial economic growth in the last few years.
Okay, let's move on. Thank you very much, Merylyn. Very interesting presentation. Let me move on to Jessica